This is Shelf Space. Sometimes, even the big guys need adult supervision. This conversation is with Karen Proud, and we discuss the newly implemented Grocery Code of Conduct in Canada, which is working to create a fair marketplace for food and beverage manufacturers and their retail partners. Karen briefly explains the origin of the UK-inspired code, and then we chat through the importance of addressing marketplace imbalances so that brands and retailers of all size can thrive. When I look into the future, transparency and accountability in supplier-retailer relationships must be at the core of our industry. So if you've been following the development of this code and you're curious to know where it's going, then I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. And before we launch in, I want to give a galactic group hug to the partners that make Shelf Space possible. Fasken, TD, Benchmark 60, Pacific Coast Distribution, Rima, and Picnic Creative. You can learn more about our sponsors in the show notes below or at shelfspacepodcast.com. Okay, here we go. Here's my conversation with Karen. Karen, thank you for joining me on Shelf Space. I'm thrilled to be having this conversation. But before we dive into the Canada Grocery Code, I'm going to ask you this. If you could imagine the future of the grocery store, what's one innovation you'd love to see while walking down your favorite aisle?
Wow, that's a great question. Maybe easier access to information. If we're looking really futuristic, and maybe it's not so futuristic, maybe I'm just old, but being able to get information like on my phone about what's down that aisle, what's in those products versus having to actually physically pick things up and read them, I think that would be a great innovation for all sorts of reasons.
I love it. Yeah. More information, make it easier to digest that information. That sounds good. Have you used the Yucca app or Yucca app?
I have not.
Check it out. It's sort of a traffic light system. Basically, you either scan a barcode or a QR code on a product, and it'll give you a ranking of its ingredients and if they're healthy, if they're dangerous, if they're good for you, if they're bad for you. And it's a great little shopping app. It's used by like tens of millions of people around the world, but in Canada, very few people use it. But it's a remarkable little tool. But it means walking around with your phone out shopping, which isn't always all of our favorite activities. So all good. Now, the real question I want to ask is why? But I can't ask that because that's not a very smart question. But why does this code need to exist in an industry where a lot of other industries don't have these types of governing documents and governing principles? They don't have that oversight that your code has. So why is it? Why are we in this place in Canada?
Well, I wasn't around when the code started. So I got the luxury of coming in at the end of 4 years of negotiations around creating this Grocery Code of Conduct. But my understanding and what I have heard about where it came from was really a concern by some in the sector about the potential for the market imbalance and larger players within the Canadian market, both on the retail side as well as on the supplier side, holding all of the power for negotiations. And that led to concerns about certain behaviors in how the sector was conducting its business. And I think the code really came about because the UK, a decade ago, brought in their own Grocery Code of Conduct to address the same concerns. And so, as we frequently do, we look around the world and say, wow, who's doing things better, or where can we steal some good ideas? And I think the sector, based on the experience in the UK, a similar situation, although the UK had frankly less concentration of retailers. I think it was pushed by some based on some concerns and then more widely embraced as others came to know what a code could do for them.
And it wasn't like the retailers got together and said, hey, we should really do this. This was sort of imposed on them or pressured. They were pressured to come into this situation. So I'm curious, from what you've seen and what you've experienced so far, what are those negotiations like? I mean, we're really talking about 4 or 5, really. I mean, the largest retailers are 4 or 5 of them. What's been the process like to sort of sit down with these people and say, we need to make changes. We need to approach supplier relationships differently. Are you in?
I mean, it was a long process. Again, I got involved towards the end, but just getting the code created took over 4 years. And it was very much a negotiation between retail and the suppliers. They were, not all early adopters of the concept of getting a code or big supporters. Some were more than others. But I think from the retail perspective, the biggest concerns that they had raised in earlier iterations of the code was, would it impact prices in a negative way? And that's where retailers really push back, because they, in many respects, see themselves as trying to manage those retail prices and expectations. Certainly my experience since my office was created in last March, we were working on other parts of the code with all of the retailers as well as the suppliers. They were looking for a pragmatic, practical approach that was going to work for the sector. I found the interventions to be incredibly helpful to get us to a better place. They told me, and when I say they, it was the largest retailer, said, as soon as you have all these details sorted out with us, we're ready to sign on. And they did exactly that. So I know it was a lot of work to get the code to where it was, and not everyone was as enthusiastic as others. But when push came to shove, we got everybody on board, first with the code and its principles, and then with the details that my office worked out over the course of last year or the end of last year. And now everybody seems to be on board.
So the basic framework is fairness, accountability, some transparency. Is this a complaint-based system? Does it, on the supplier side, does it mean that someone needs to raise a red flag and submit a ticket and appeal or make a proposal about how they were unfairly treated? Or are there other players in the game that sort of help navigate this or sort of support this exchange and sort of concerns or opportunities around, whether something's been done fairly? And I think about delisting as one example that, these brands go through so much work. It's so hard to get grocery account, especially a banner across the country. And when they get delisted, getting relisted with that same retailer is nearly impossible. They have to change brokers or distributors or change their name or have to do a whole bunch of things. So what is it like for a brand that feels that they've been treated unfairly? Where do they go? What do they do?
Yeah, so the code, it is really about a number of principles and fairness, transparency, creating a better business environment. My office, which is tasked with implementing the code and trying to ensure that folks are adhering to the code and educating about the code, we do operate very much on a complaints type of basis, where if a supplier or a retailer, because the Canadian code differs from the UK code in that it is a reciprocal code. So, there is an onus on the supplier side as well. But if there is a concern about how the code is being implemented, or if there's a breach of the code, the company that has those concerns can come to my office and raise them. And there's a number of different ways they can do that with us. So we have a portal where they can put in their form and make their complaint to us. They can also just talk to us. We are frequently in conversations with the retailers and suppliers. They can go through their industry trade associations if this is more of a systemic issue that might affect a lot of folks within the same group. Say it's a new policy or a behavior of one party that affects many. They can go through their trade association. So those things get raised with us in many different ways. We will then make some determinations as to whether there's code issues or not, because I think there's still some people who think the code is a panacea and does everything. And there's, specific things that the code does and there's things it does not. We would then really try to work with the other parties to try and drive kind of compliance with the code through discussions and education. That's probably 90% of our job, is really just trying to educate people around the code. If people are raising concerns and we agree that they may be concerns and systemic issues, it's really us trying to talk to the other party to say, hey, Have you looked at your policy in relation to this section of the code? You may want to have a look at that. So not to do that adjudication, violated the code, you must fix this. This is a voluntary code. It's an industry code, and we want to work with the industry. The other means, though, if you're not getting what you need through more informal channels, companies can raise formal disputes with us. That's where they fill out a form, they make a formal dispute, they believe that the code has been violated. The other party will be notified that there is a formal complaint against you. It comes to my office, we'll do our first triage. Was it a code-related issue? Yes or no? Then we offer mediation services, so they can go through that process if they try and work it out. Or if that doesn't work, or if the parties don't want mediation, then it comes to me for decision-making or adjudication, where I will determine whether there was a code breach or not a code breach. If that happens, then if there is a code breach, then I would issue a public notice. So this is my public-facing tool where I would issue a notice of noncompliance explaining, what company was not compliant, what section of the code, some detail without giving away confidential business information. And then that company would have to come back to me with their action plan as to how they're going to fix the issue. That, I think, is an extreme. That's the grenade over the wall. We can't sort it out, and we really need you to address it. Versus what I said is 90% of the job, which is really just us trying to get people to work together, adhere to the code, and through education and discussion, trying to drive that compliance.
I have this mental picture of you interrupting regularly scheduled programming to come on CBC with an announcement, but I realize that's not what's going on there.
If they would only take such interest, that would be wonderful.
That's a good thing too. One of the things that I see and hear a lot from food manufacturers is the concerns around the money coming off their invoices, and that by the time they finally get paid from the grocery store, and not everyone realizes that sometimes that can be 60, 90, 180. It can be a many, many days. We've all heard horror stories, but it's the transparency of what's coming off the invoice. It's the deductions, it's the penalties, it's the listing, restocking programs. And of course, when manufacturers look at that math, sometimes they can push back, sometimes they can ask questions, but it's usually so late. It comes back around like weeks or months later. It's really hard to defend or sort of address these individual items. So the code looks like it sort of helps create a more fair landscape in that the manufacturers will be notified earlier or in advance or with a lot more transparency. Do you see that actually translating yet, or is it still early days to sort of bring that level of process to these invoices?
It is early days. We've just started full implementation at the beginning of this month. But leading up to this, I know that many of the companies have been reviewing their policies and their procedures and looking to see whether those are actually code compliant or not. The code does aim to improve transparency and certainty, and that is around the sorts of deductions that can be taken or not. So the code, leans heavily to people having written agreements where it's very clear, if you deliver X, this is what we're going to do. And if you're going to be late on your delivery, here's what the fees structure looks like. And so, we're not eliminating fees and deductions. That's not the purpose of the code, but we're bringing more transparency to what those are. So you should be, as a supplier or manufacturer, very well aware of, if I do this, I'm going to get a deduction, and that deduction is going to be this. And it should be very clear in your agreement. And it should be something that you can also count on to be consistent, and that your retailer, your customer won't be able to just unilaterally change things or unilaterally impose fees that you hadn't otherwise agreed to. So those things should start to go away and bring more certainty to the business relationship. As I said, it's not going to eliminate the fees, but you should know what they are. You should expect when you're going to get them. You should know sort of the process that they will go through to determine whether or not you're going to have to pay a fee or get a deduction. The timing of things should be more clear as to when those things will apply. There should be mechanisms then that if you disagree, that you can go through a process of dispute resolution internally. So all of those things should be much more clear, but it doesn't eliminate the fees. That's not part of the code.
Yeah, I totally get that. And, especially late fees always stand out to me as one of those things where I hear manufacturers complain, and then I usually find myself asking, well, but were you late? I mean, I know there's always extraneous circumstances, but the reality is that sometimes fees are fees. That's the part of business.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why some fees were imposed to address certain behaviors on the other side. And I'm not here to opine as to whether or not those fees are acceptable, but there is a reason that certain things exist. It's the same. You mentioned delisting earlier, and that is a subject that does get addressed also in the code. It is the retailer's choice whether or not they want to delist a product for whatever reason they want. And the code is very clear. No one can be forced to buy a product from anyone, and nobody can be forced to sell something to someone, and you're allowed to delist products. The issue becomes with regards to the process of delisting and the timing and the notification and the rationale. So, the last thing you want as a supplier is to walk into a big grocer and suddenly you see your product heavily discounted because it's going to be delisted and you didn't even know about it. So the code really talks about the process needs to be fair. It leaves it purposely kind of ambiguous so that people can determine based on the situation what is fair and what is not. So maybe it's fair that a product gets delisted and you get notified and it's 60 days and we're done. But depending on the circumstance, that may not be fair. So is it a product that was made specifically for that retailer? And then maybe, 6 weeks notice is not fair. Is it one product or is it a whole series of products that are being listed? Is it your entire portfolio? Can you reasonably, find another route to market for your products? So the code does say, you can't just make a decision, you're delisted, off you go. You really have to think about the circumstances and do the right thing when it comes to being fair with your supplier.
And the code is sprinkled with the word in good faith. And that to me sounds like, well, if it isn't in the terms and conditions, then sort of the rule of humanity should probably come into play here a little bit, that, that both sides should operate in good faith. Wording like that, do you find that it can be reasonably discussed that, this was or was not in good faith? Or how do you find that determination now that the code is in action?
So good faith, there's a number of terms. There's reasonableness, there's good faith. So good faith is actually defined in the code itself, and it is a standard, a legal standard that seems to be, people seem to be familiar with it, which is it's consistent with certain behaviors, but not to operate at your own detriment. So, there's no expectation that people are supposed to be so good that it's to their own detriment. But I think there's a common understanding of good faith. Reasonableness, what one person thinks is reasonable, the other may not. That's one of the reasons my office now exists, because at the end of the day, we will, if push comes to shove, we will determine what was reasonable and what was not, based on hearing the entire situation, and from all parties, we can make a determination as what we would believe is reasonable in the situation. We can also work without having to adjudicate. We can also work with parties to talk through and even ask the questions to hopefully lead them to their own determination as to whether or not they acted reasonably. And I think that, most people, when you can sit down and have a conversation and start asking and probing questions on the issues, will likely come to their own determination as to whether or not their actions were really reasonable.
Yeah, well said. I was delighted to read the ESG remarks in the code, and that the code is sort of in hopes to encourage or sort of support environmental and social government aspirations. There's not a lot of language around it, but at least it's in there. However, maybe it's politically, maybe it's economically, ESG efforts are really sort of taken a hit over the last year and a half. And what do you see the future of that piece of the puzzle? Do you see retailers and manufacturers still sort of holding on and looking to make gains in their ESG programs, or do you sort of see it with a big pause button right now?
And that's hard to say, and I haven't really been sort of occupied with those aspects within the industry. I think, every company is different and has their own commitments around where they're going with ESG, what it even means to them. That shifts sometimes for political reasons, but also for what public expects. I can say that, within the grocery sector, they are a very public-facing organizations. The brands are very public-facing. Their corporate reputations are extremely important to them, for the retailers as well. And so, what I have experienced just in my conversation is they care deeply about what their customers think of their behaviors and activities, and are certainly going to take their cues from what their customers expect of them. That's actually one of the big sticks for the office in our ability to name people who are not compliant with the code, is that goes right to the heart of your corporate reputation, which is very important to these companies, those companies who really serve the public. And without the faith from their customers, they're not going to be able to continue to do business the way they do. And so I think that's just inherent in a sector that feeds the population.
I remember the bread price fixing scandal that was a while ago. And I'm not quite sure the timeline about how that scenario impacted the development of the code. But when looking at these large, it's just really any retailer, if they act badly, or brands, if they do something that falls out of line with what consumers and what Better Business Bureaus and what people expect, it's when there's an opportunity to make sure that the public knows about it. It's an important step so that there can be, if transparency isn't there naturally, then it has to be forced upon. That's, I think, what makes for maybe a healthy ecosystem for sure. You had mentioned training and sort of educating people. Does that mean, are you guys running workshops? Are you doing trust falls? Are you doing retreats? Are you doing webinars? How do you communicate the code, and especially how everyone's meant to implement it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're still figuring out how much we still need to do in educating about the code. So right out of the gate, when the office was created, we created our website. We've got a communications approach where we're putting out a newsletter every month to try and reach as many people as we can. Last year, so we started in March. By the end of last year, I had attended over 80 industry meetings or events. I spoke at more than 20 conferences, really trying as a first step is just to raise awareness, because there were a lot of people who didn't even know the code existed or didn't know what the code was and what our office was. So our first efforts was really just about raising awareness. The code exists. It's going to be coming into force. Here's what the office does. We put out a few tools. So we did a guidance document on how to actually read the code. So if you think you've got an issue, where do you start? And how do you read through the code to see whether or not you actually have an issue? So we put that guidance out. We did our first webinars in the fall where we went through some of the code and our guidance document that we had put out. We're planning a couple of new webinars early this year as well, one on the dispute resolution mechanism, and then there's another more technical one that we're planning. We're going to continue to talk to the stakeholder groups, so the industry associations that have conferences, we're going to continue to go there and talk to folks. We're also going to move towards sort of identifying where there are other people out there doing code training. So there are a couple of companies out there who provide training to companies, and we're going to be listing those on our website, pointing people to where they might get training. It's important for us that people have the tools they need. Towards the end of last year, we did a survey of the sector, and we specifically asked about, whether people had gotten training, whether they were interested, what they sort of saw as the role of the association. We're just getting those details back on the survey, and that may help point us in the right direction. I would say, for the large companies, so the big retailers, the large suppliers, for the most part, they've already undertaken training. They're probably that top group that understands how to work with the code. Our surveys, we're hoping to identify where are those pockets where we really need to give some extra help because they don't really know how to use the code as a tool and then what to do if there's an issue. So we'll be planning that throughout the rest of this year as to how we engage and make sure that people, are able to use the code. We're tossing around some ideas of doing some animated videos and things like that as well, just to try and reach people where they are and not expect everyone to come to a conference or everyone to watch a webinar or everyone's going to read our newsletter. Where can we do the most within our small team? Because we have limited resources as well.
I'll put my vote in for a puppet show or a pantomime. Karen, my last question for you is, what's the future of this code? Does it just get amended and get more elaborate as you go? Does it have a shelf life? Is the goal for one day that it can vaporize and we don't need it? Curious to know where you see this going down the road.
I don't know. So if we look at other countries that have been put in place grocery codes of conduct, if we look at the UK and Australia and New Zealand, starting with a voluntary code, they ended up with a regulated code. So the government came in, the voluntary code didn't work, government had to come in and impose a code. I don't know that that's the fate of the Canadian code. It's my job to try and make this code work and make sure that everybody is on board and continues to be that way. We're going to, and in fact, we have to review the code every year to see what's working, what's not working. Do we need to update the code, amend it? We certainly don't want to add more complexity. The beauty of our code is it's principle-based. It allows for flexibility. It allows the industry to continue doing business in a quick and easy way. I have committed that within the next 18 to 24 months, if things are not working, so if people are saying to my office, you know what, we're not going to abide by the code, it's not interesting for us, we're going to report on that. And we will be reporting on an annual basis whether or not the code is working, whether we believe that there are things that need to be changed about the code, and whether we need government to step in and regulate. Again, my hope is that's not the case, but there's a number of ways that this could go. Ideally, we've got a code that works. We get to a stage where everybody is compliant with the provisions of the code and the principles. And my office has very little to do other than, some education, some reminders here and there, the odd little complaint, and that we end up with an industry that has gotten to such a level that the working relationship is much better, that they've moved from sort of transactional to more strategic working together. That is the ideal, and we hope to drive that. But if that doesn't happen, and if we can't get this code off the ground, we may end up with a future where it's government intervention. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid, because I think we've got a solid base, a solid code. We've got an industry that has come together and agreed to abide by it. We've got a good shot at doing what others could not.
I love it. It'd be great to see Canada leading in this way, to sort of, like you said, have a voluntary code that kind of lifts everybody up and sort of levels the playing field and makes a food supply chain, a value chain that everyone feels they have a part to play and that they can all thrive in. And there are times, especially over the last couple of years, where food manufacturers have really struggled more than other players just because of costs and tariffs and stuff like that. It'd be great to see just this effort continue so that there's someone like you in your office to champion, both sides of the equation. And for those retailers that aren't in the big group, the big 4 or 5, those retailers that are smaller or emerging or sort of they're growing their footprint in their communities and in their provinces, they want to also be able to thrive and to have a framework that's there for them as well. I like the fact that it's not just exclusive to the big retailers, that smaller retailers can also say, yeah, this is important to us and we are committed to operating in a more transparent, fair way.
Well, and for the smaller retailers, it's so important for them because they have issues as well within the system. So their main concerns leading up to this code was allocation of supply. So, we all, I'm sure, can remember back to COVID where you couldn't find a roll of toilet paper to save your life. And, when it did come in and you could see it on the shelf, it was only in the big stores. And these independent grocers, some of which are the only option for people in small towns or the only convenient option for people, are always fighting for that supply. And the supply has been going in the past to the big retailers because, suppliers are going to supply their biggest customers. Well, the code addresses that. It says that, in the case of supply shortages or constraints, the suppliers need to take into account the needs of their other customers as well. And that is so important, especially, as I said, when you're dependent on that independent retailer because it's the most convenient one to you. You want to support that independent retailer. Maybe they're the only person where you are. Canadians across Canada should have the same access to products, whether you're shopping in a big store or an independent store, especially those essential products.
I mean, what a great example of good faith, because that would require a company with massive buying power to withhold some of that power, to not buy as much. And so that in reality, that'll be really interesting to see how it takes shape. The next time there's a flood or a atmospheric river or a pandemic, hopefully we'll never see one of those again. But those types of things can be really disruptive. So I appreciate that you guys are leaning into that. Code leans into that. And in reality, it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. Maybe we could have like a list. I know you've got some items and categories that are included and not included in the code, but maybe we should have a call out for toilet paper and maple syrup.
Truly Canadian products.
Exactly. Karen, thank you for the time. Thanks for joining me, and I really appreciate being able to chat this through.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shelf Space. If you like what you hear, I would be eternally grateful for a 5-star rating and a quick share on social. Your support means the world to me and our partners, TD, Fasken, Rima, Pacific Coast Distribution, Picnic Creative, and Benchmark 60. For bonus content and resources from our sponsors, go to shelfspacepodcast.com. I'm Corwin Hiebert. I'm glad we're on this rocket ship together. I'll see you in the future.